So I just managed to unmute my microphone on time. Phew. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to Bev and Etienne, who I'm going to introduce together. It's really fantastic that they're able to join us, and in fact, they're almost so well known in our field that they don't need introduction. But just in case you don't know, Etienne is best known for his seminal work on communities of practice, and in fact, he established the term with Jean Lave and social learning theory. And Bev is known for her pioneering work in international settings, learning across boundaries and the use of social media. And they work together, bringing breadth and depth and an innovative edge to what they do. I've been on the website. They also have a long history, both of them, with km4dev. They've both been members for a long time, and there was a rather infamous birthday party of Bev's at the face-to-face event in Brighton, where Nancy White organised all of us to sing "It's Raining Men" to Bev on her birthday, and all the men there walked over and also kissed her hand. And I don't know if you know.
I'm the one who got her.
So you had a lot of competition, Etienne, I tell you. Actually, "It's Raining Men" is really a very, very difficult song to sing, and it was absolute omnishambles. But anyway, the video has luckily disappeared. But on to serious matters. Together they work on many different books and projects, and fantastic that they're here today to talk about their latest book, Learning to Make a Difference, Value Creation in Social Learning Spaces. And as we know, communities of practice and learning spaces are really central to this km4dev community. And what we're going to do is I'm going to ask two questions. I have the great privilege of asking two questions. There's going to be some interesting questions, I think, about trust and communities. We also would like, if you're interested in ordering their book, which I've already done, that one of my colleagues is going to put into the chat the link where you can buy it. It's been published by Cambridge University Press. So my first question, which is rather a large one, is could you maybe give us a little bit of an idea what you were trying to achieve with this new book? Over to you, thank you.
You know, we didn't set out with like, what are we going to achieve? What we did was we had started to write in 2011, we wrote something about value creation in community practice, because community practice on the whole are pretty useless at talking about the value they create. In those days, in the early days, it was like, oh no, it's all too hard. It's very subtle. We can't say it. Or it was an organization saying, you've got to do it. You've got to give us some numbers. Otherwise it doesn't produce value. And so we wrote something then, which was meant to be a way of talking about value, which was a way for communities to promote and articulate the value. And so many people said, you should write that up as a book. So we set out to write it as a book. And we wrote it, and we wrote it, and then we changed it, and we wrote it, and we wrote it, and we shared it. And it then just became bigger and bigger until we found ourselves writing about social learning. And we realized that value creation and social learning are so intertwined that you can't separate them.
And actually the framework that we had been working on to help communities articulate the value that they create and to help members of these communities, not necessarily professional evaluators, but members of the communities themselves articulate the value that they are getting from the community. The reason why we realized that the framework we were building was useful for people is that in some sense, the framework itself was a kind of model of social learning. So it was more than an evaluative framework. It was allowing people to tell the story of their experience, because it was the elements of the framework represented that experience, if you will. And so something that started more like an evaluation framework ended up forcing us to restate the theory in new ways, to take into account the fact that people found it very comfortable to use that framework to talk about their experience of social learning.
So thank you. Maybe you'd explain a little bit what the framework involves.
The framework involves talking about the value created by community practice, in fact, 8 different types of value. So we don't talk about value as one thing, but we talk about communities producing different types of value. And so they create different kinds of value for members. So for example, the value of simply being with other people who are like you or share the same problems as you, that has a value in and of itself. But producing stuff, new ideas and tools is also another kind of value. Then there's also the value of changing your practice, right, as a result of having a new tool. And there's the value of the impact that you create. So for example, those are 4 different kinds of value. Mm-hmm. And so the framework is talking about value in different ways, but also how one value flows into another. If you've got a good community, how it helps you to produce stuff that's going to be useful for you, that's going to help you change your practice, that's going to make a change in the world. So, so the framework is talking about different kinds of value, and then the flow of value from one thing to the other. And then it also talks about the loops. If you can see that this kind of atmosphere helps to create some really good tools, then that gives you a little loop. It says, oh, right, we seem to produce more if we behave like this. So there's another kind of value, which is a loop.
Okay, thanks very much for that. So one of the other things you're talking about is you want to rescue, you want to shift how people think of learning, and you want to rescue it from the backwaters. Can you? I mean, I think a lot of people here are working in development organisations which talk about a lot about learning, but maybe are not so good at doing it actually. But could you maybe talk about a little bit about this? And let me just, I've got the privilege of asking quite a lot of questions, but after this question, which is about backwater learning as a backwater in the backwaters, then there's an opportunity for others to ask questions. So over to you, Bev and Etienne.
Well, when you talk about learning, many people use their experience of schooling to think about learning is. And many people, when you talk about learning, think about learning as the transmission of certainty from someone who knows to someone who doesn't. And that's a lot of the kind of mental models that people have when you talk about learning. And in some sense, we want to rescue what we think learning is from that very stilted model. And that's why for us, we start pushing not the transmission of certainty as learning, but more the common experience of uncertainty together as a way to rethink a problem, as a way to rethink a situation. So instead of thinking of learning as this sort of linear transmission from one person who knows to a person who doesn't, we think about learning as this collective process of trying to make a difference by engaging with each other's uncertainty to the point where we increase our capacity to make the difference we want to make. So in some sense, that's the move that we're trying to push with this book.
Great, thank you very much, Etienne. So over to César, maybe to ask to get questions from other people.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you. Well, we have one request from Sundaraj in India. He's asking if you can share a real life example of value on how the community achieved it, if you have any practical example.
Well, we've got so many, it's hard to know where to start, but we could talk about the one that we write about in the book to bring it a bit to life, which is, for example, I mean, the example that we use a lot in the book, Funchok, who was a woman who belonged to a community of people in Southeast Asia who were working on local government, improving local government and getting it more more powerful, really. And anyway, she was particularly interested in women's empowerment in local government, so more women being elected in local government. And she was from Bhutan. And in her community, she went off, they had a secretariat who sent them to a similar group, who's doing something similar in Bangalore in India. And they went there, and so they went and they visited Bangalore, and as she explains in her story, we fell in love. You know, seeing other women who are doing the same thing as us, trying to get more women in local government, we fell in love. So there already you have your first value. Wow, there are other people in the world doing something similar to us. And when they were there, because they would fallen in love and they were so receptive to hearing their ideas, and they just picked up, you know, they were just like picking up ideas left, right, and center. But one of the things that struck them was that whereas in Bhutan, they had a strategy for women, in Bangalore, they had a 5-pronged strategy depending on where you were in the election cycle. And in Bhutan, they hadn't actually thought of that. And they thought, wow, that's amazing. We're coming up to our elections. So we need to have our own specific strategy, which is just pre-election, where we focus all our attention on a very small subset of women just to get them in. They hadn't thought of that before. They got it because they were in Bangalore and got that idea from them. More value, all right? An idea which they were able to put into practice. They went back to Bhutan and they focused on the women who had the most potential to pass the literacy test, because in order to get into local government, to get elected, you had to pass a literacy test. And so they just focused on the women who were most likely to pass the literacy test instead of all women. And they managed to get many more women, double the number of women, to pass the literacy test. More value. Okay, another kind of value, but still value. And as a result, double the number of women were elected into local government. More value, right? So there I've spoken about 4 different kinds of value for those women there. And I've also talked about a flow of value, a flow from a field visit to Bangalore, which took you through the value of meeting other people like you, getting ideas from them, putting them into practice, and something in the world changing as a result.
And I think what was important there is that the story is not just simply a little story. It's really retracing how learning led to making a difference. And so the genre of story, which we call value creation story, is an important learning device because it shows how an idea becomes really, see what I mean? Often people think, oh, I got the knowledge, therefore I've done the learning. But in our experience, learning doesn't end just because you got a new pieces of knowledge in your head. You need to apply this knowledge, you need to do something with it. And in the doing something with that idea, there's as much learning that happens there as there is in the acquisition of the idea in the first place. So for us, we see really learning as going into practice. And then actually, Funchuk brought back that story to her network. And people were very interested in the story because the story actually conveyed that loop of learning between an event that was organized by the network to a difference that was made in Bhutan.
That's right. So when she told that story, suddenly all her network, people from other countries in Southeast Asia, they also got that same idea from that she had got. They understood this idea of having a five-pronged strategy for getting women into local government. They wanted to know more about how did you, when you got back, what were the problems you had? Well, how did you do it? How did you speak to local officials on the ground to get them, to get more women doing the functional literacy test? So all of these details became part of the learning of the whole community.
So somebody said, like in the chat, yeah, that's exactly right. There are two types of value measures. And actually in the book, we distinguish between, between what we call effect measures and attribution or contribution measures. That because the government in that story had kept track of the proportion of women in local government. So there was a measure there of that was not even kept by Funchuk. It was a measure that already existed in the world. But what was important was to connect that existing measure with a story that gave some credit to the community for having contributed to that change in the world. Because if we said, oh yeah, we belong to this network and the number of women has doubled in local government in Bhutan, it's like, oh, okay, but how do we know? So normally, if you do an evaluation in a very formal way, you would control for all the other variables. You'd say, okay, yeah, well, we can control for that variable, control for the other, and there can only be one thing that is causal. But in reality, in most contexts where we work, you cannot do that. You cannot control for all the variables and all the competing hypotheses. So that story that gives the process is actually a substitute for controlling all the other variables by saying that story makes a pretty good case that the community contributed something. The story doesn't say, it's not like a causal attribution. You're saying the community caused that. That's why we call it contribution data, because it's making a plausible case that the community had actually helped make a difference that mattered in Bhutan. And so what we are saying is that when you do an evaluation, you need to try to, as much as possible, combine these two types of value. Because if you just had the story, it's oh, well, maybe. But once you have a piece of data like that collected by Gamma, plus the story, it's the two together that gives you a plausible and fairly robust picture of what the community had done.
And yes, Joanne, we're talking about, well, in fact, we're not even necessarily talking about community practice here. In this case, with Funchuk, it was a network. We wrote the framework originally for communities of practice and networks, but we have seen since then, we have seen so many different structures using it. We've seen training courses use it, social learning spaces, we've seen all sorts of people. So the framework is not just, and the stories that we're talking about and the measures, they're not just for community practice. They can be used by anybody for anything, actually. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, for that. I just want to give the floor again to Cesar to ask another question from the chat.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. We have about 5 to 6 questions and some comments from members, so it's difficult to make justice to everything that is being asked, but I will just pick one. We have a question from Tolase Olatino. He's asking, is measuring the financial value of knowledge management feasible presently, or should the organizations just focus more on social value of knowledge management? So the financial value or the social value?
I think to a large extent, a question like that has to depend on who are the stakeholders and what do they care about. I mean, if your financing of your organization, of your group depends on people who really care about the financial value, you're going to have to make a good case to them that there is some financial value, otherwise it will stop, or you've got to find funding somewhere else. So, I mean, to some extent, you have to be pragmatic about these things. So, I mean, and we would say really it doesn't have to be either or, it can be both. If you have stories, like, you know, people can have a story of value, which is my community of practice is just fantastic. I've had you know, I love to feel like I'm not alone. And I got this great idea from somebody in another department, which I then tried out in my own department. And now we save probably, I don't know, 1 hour a week, which must save the organization X amount of dollars, right? So there you've got a story, the story is qualitative data, but it leads to a financial saving by the organization. So you've got a story that tells you about, you've got some qualitative data that brings life to some quantitative data. So it doesn't have to be either or.
And that's why we talk about value creation, because value creation really depends on what counts as value, you know, and what counts as value can be different for different people. The question is, can we see a causal chain that a community makes a difference to something that matters to someone, you know? And so sometimes it's social, sometimes it's financial, sometimes it has to, like in the case of Funcho, the value was have a few more women in local government. That will make a difference. For her, there was a big difference. It was not financial, it was more like, that's going to make a difference to the country. And, you know, it went like from 2% to 4% or something very small. But for her, it was a big achievement. For her, it was like, wow, you know, we've done something that is going to help our country in the long term.
Okay, so thanks very much. Just one follow-up question. Do you have a particular way of doing stories? Because obviously quite often you need to have a conversation with people for them to actually recognize the value that they're gaining from a community. Do you have a format or a way of doing that?
We have found that the most effective way is to have conversations with people. So we have a format, we have some questions. Actually, I shared some questions in km4dev. So really sitting down and talking to people, because you're right, for many people, they don't think in terms of value. And in fact, a big danger of people in community practice is that they tend to talk about, I love my community. I love being with these other people. And that's it. Or I get some really good ideas and that's it. So you need to probe. So what? How do those ideas change what you do? And what happens as a result? So yeah, sitting down and just asking people. So we do have a format, which is to sit down and ask to people. And depending on how tight you want the stories to be, you may come back and have a second conversation with them, maybe a third, maybe a fourth, depending on how tight you want the story.
Thank you. Yeah, because
it is also important to say that the framework is fairly intuitive, okay? And so some communities learn the genre, you know, and some communities start a meeting by saying, anybody has a value creation story? And people have learned what that means. And they say, yeah, I do. You remember in December when we talked about this and this? Well, I tried this and this and this. And you know what? It didn't work. So a value creation story is not necessarily a success story. It's just a way to convey a chain of events that leads to an interesting result. Okay. And so some communities are learning that genre. And so it's become part of their routine, even at the end of a meeting, to say, anybody can see a value creation story coming out of what we just discussed. And you'll say, yeah, you know, that idea that you mentioned, I think I could do something with it. And it's something to follow up the next time. So the genre of stories become a kind of engine of continuity to create loops, or instead of having committee of meetings where you say, okay, today the topic is blah, 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 and next time the topic is blah, 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 you create this continuous loop of learning by saying, by asking people, you remember we had this case clinic with you and we gave you that advice. What did you do with it? Tell us the story, you know? And so that makes you think of a community much more as an ongoing learning loop rather than a series of meetings. And I think that's an important distinction.
I think this is also something we can learn a lesson from km4dev as well, because I think that community creates a lot of value, but mostly if you ask us what we think about it, we just say we love it and we love the people. So we also have these questions that I think we should ask ourselves. So another question I have, and I think after that we should maybe give another question from the floor. The other question I have is that lots of organizations are creating communities of practice because they see they potentially have value, and they but how can we convince organizations of the value of communities of practice? Do you have some sort of examples of ways we can do that?
Well, again, it depends so much on the context, but number one is really to talk about value creation. If you want to convince your organization, we see so many people who try to persuade their organization that communities of practice are good in and of themselves. It's like some ideological thing. We need a community of practice because it's good, because we learn. But you don't want that. You want to say, if we have people working like this, and as far as the organization is concerned, it could be a community practice, it could be a picnic, it doesn't matter. But what they want to know is it's going to have make some change that is positive to the organization. So having a story, an aspirational story, for example, doesn't even have to be a real story, but if we had a community of practice, or if we had this group of people who met regularly to share their challenges and to work on them together, can you imagine what would happen if we discovered how to change this practice and have this result? So you've actually got an aspirational story to give to the organization. So when talking to an organization, it's good to know, first of all, what they value. Think of value. What is value creation for them? And then make the connection between how the activity of the community of practice is going to lead to that or not. And if it's not, what other thing it's going to lead to, which is of value to the organization.
Okay, thank you for that, Cesar. Do you want to maybe raise one of the questions?
Yes, definitely. We have so many questions, but I think we have something to shake the floor a little bit. We have Pavel Kraus. Hi, Pavel. He wrote, basically, there are two types of, sorry, no, I want to read this other one. He wrote, when we save people 1 hour a week, then they just drink longer coffee. Such type of arguments we saw in the 90s. They do not work in serious organizations. Only outcome-related KPIs work.
Well, I mean, it depends on who the person is that you're trying to convince. For some people, saving 1 hour a week is a convincing argument. There's no point in using it with people who are not going to be convinced by it. But yeah, if whatever the KPIs are, you know, it's good to be strategic and to know what they are and to see whether or not what you're doing is going to contribute to that or not. Because if it's not going to contribute to that, if your community practice is not going to contribute to what the organization thinks is important, well, you're going to have to do it underground, or you're going to have to find some other way to do it. But you can't expect, you know, a budget from your organization with KPIs, you know, that don't match what your community is going to do, the value it's going to create.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to get one more question in while I have the opportunity. What do you think is the relationship between trust and social learning, and is creating trust necessary for social learning?
Well, to the extent that social learning, at least the way we describe it, is anchored in the experience of practice. And what we are claiming is that true learning really starts and ends in practice. Then you need some level of trust to be able to talk about the experience of practice the way it is. Because a lot of learning processes, they talk about things the way they should be, rather than anchoring the learning in the way things are, you know? And if you are a teacher and your experience is you want to strangle the student because the student is driving you so nuts, you know, you need to be able to talk about that, you know, with colleagues who are not going to judge you, because that's your experience. And if you want to become a better teacher, you're going to have to start where you are in practice, not start by some kind of theoretical aspiration. You're going to have to start by dealing with your daily experience of practice. And so, yes, it does take a certain amount of trust to say, okay, I can talk about my real experience of practice and we're going to discuss together how to make it better. But we have to have the ground truth. If learning is going to be anchored in real experience, we're going to have to agree that we start with the ground truth, as they do in the after action review.
You need to know that people aren't going to roll their eyes. You know, they're not going to say, huh, you are so stupid, you know, or
well, I'm going to report you, or
yeah, I'm going to report you. So that kind of trust, because there's so many, I mean, trust is such a big, vague word, really. You know, you can always say trust. But when we talk about trust, what we're talking about is that you can talk about the dirty business of practice, because practice is messy. Practice is full of micro decisions that work or don't work. And you've got to be able to talk about those. And you need to be able to talk about them with other people who care about it. If I talk about it with my kids, yeah, I trust my kids or my family, but really they're not interested. So I've got to trust that the people I'm talking to will be interested.
And you know, we talk about this mutual engagement of uncertainty. There's a certain vulnerability to offering your uncertainty as a learning device for a group of people. But the reason we think it's so important is that our experience with people who are really good at what they do is not that they proceed from certainty and they know what to do and they just implement it. In fact, practitioners have become very, very good at dealing with uncertainty.
Or expert practitioners.
Expert practitioners are very good at functioning under conditions of uncertainty, making productive decisions under conditions of uncertainty. And to touch that place where people can learn from there, it takes a certain amount of trust. It's not the trust that, oh, I can leave my wallet on the table and you're not going to take it. It's trust that here we want to talk about making real progress, you know, making real progress
In practice.
And making real progress, not by assuming that if we knew, we would be all certain, by collectively understanding that we are bathing in uncertainty, but we still have to proceed, we still have to do things. And this is the key to how we can learn to make a difference together.
And Ray is right, trust is vital if you want people to discuss failures, but we would say trust is vital if you want people to talk about learning, about what happens in practice.
Yeah.
And, you know,
Failure is, of course, only one part.
Yeah, failures or partial successes or partial failures. That's what practice is. Practice is like, you know, when you talk about what happens in practice, it's just like micro decisions of failure, which you are constantly adjusting and readjusting to kind of make a little bit better, to inch better. And then when you tell the story afterwards, it looks all smooth and wonderful and it looks like a success. But within it are lots of little micro failures. That's what learning is, talking about micro failures and micro successes and micro partial successes.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Bev and Etienne. That was really very, very interesting. And maybe we could give you a round of applause using our reaction icon. So there we go from me. So thank you very much. It's been great.
Thank you.
And we'll definitely compile all the questions and maybe send them on to you in case you're interested. And many, many thanks. And I'm going to hand back to Cesar.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Well, we had many questions still in the chat that we didn't address, but we will pass them on to the speakers and we will share them somehow after the event together with a video of this session. So now we are going to have a discussion on the recent interactions that we had in the km4dev list, also about value creation in communities of practice. And for this, I will give the floor to Chris Zielinski, who is a Director of Partnerships in Health Information at the University of Winchester in the UK. And he was also the Director of Health and Biomedical Information at WHO. So the floor is yours, Chris.
Thank you, Cesar and Sarah. I'm very glad to be here with such distinguished speakers. And I realize we have a very short time for this next interview, but I think we can fit it in. I'll be talking to Ilaria, who's a new member of the km4dev core group. She works in Rome, Italy at the International Fund for Agricultural Development as a knowledge management and communities of practice consultant. And previously she was a manager of Europe Aid funded projects at ARS Projects Company. So the reason I'm interviewing Ilaria now is because she started a discussion of creating value on the km4dev list. And I'm going to ask her a couple of questions related to this discussion. So Ilaria, if I may, you started this discussion on the list. What are the challenges you're facing, and could you explain them?
Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you, Chris, for your question. So in IFAD, we recently started supporting our communities and networks in a more structured way, thanks to the new KM strategy. So we moved from having 2 informal COPs at the beginning of the last year to 11 COPs today. We have been providing support to COPs owners, a collaboration platform to us, the communities, and trainings on how to manage and facilitate COPs. So we do have a structure in place now, and we want to demonstrate the value of our communities. We need to prove the value that COPs bring in our work to our senior management, because we need to ensure that communities will be institutionalized, funded adequately, and planned in a strategic way at the corporate level. So the challenge that we face in collecting value creation stories is that most of our communities have been established just recently, and others are in their piloting phase. So it might be a bit risky to ask some questions about the impact, but I've gone through all the suggestions that I received in km4dev, and I found fully inspirational inputs on how to do it.
Great. How are these inputs helping you in dealing with these issues? I mean, that's of interest to us.
Yeah, so as I said, we received amazing inputs that will definitely help us. First, to assess the value of our communities, we want to follow BEMP and Etienne's approach of triangulating the data by combining quantitative indicators and stories. So to have a more robust picture of the contribution of our communities. Then in our value creation framework, we will have some starter questions that will be used to guide the storytelling process rather than following a structured interview protocol. So as John Owen said in one of his contribution in the chat, the conversation will be left open for follow-up questions so that we won't lose important evidence and details that can form the story that we want to tell. And finally, in Bev et Etienne's latest publication, they mentioned that even the negative examples of value can contribute to our evaluation framework. So we will probably include questions and discussions around members' aspirations and uncertainties, because this question will help us in understanding what we can do next for our COPs to promote their growth and development. And just to conclude, regarding the question to ask in order to collect the stories, like the starter question, some of the queries shared by Ivan Butina can be adapted to our context as well, because some of them can really work for recently established COPs, such as in which way do you think the COP is contributing to the organization, or what do you think are the biggest benefits for this community? So we will adapt the question that is shared. So I'm sure that all the inputs are definitely helping us in creating the framework for our value creation stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilaria. Okay, I think we're open to questions at this point. I don't know, Cesar, if you have any that are current. And
reading through the chat, but so far there's none addressed directly to you or Ilaria, but everyone is welcome to continue to post.
Okay. We're open to comments at this point. Do I see a raised hand there? No. Well, we could tackle one of the other questions while people are thinking about these that were addressed to Etienne. And
yes.
If you like.
Okay, we have one question from Charles Dewa. He's asking, one of the terms thrown into knowledge management conversations is knowledge asset. Is it correct to view your value creation framework as a knowledge asset?
I'm not 100% sure of the question. Just generally speaking, I think we'd say that knowledge assets are what we would call potential value within the framework. A knowledge asset, in other words, a piece of knowledge or a tool or something new that you've created, we call potential value. Potential because until you actually use it in practice, it is potential value. It's important in and of itself, right? But it's not something that has yet run through practice, been adapted and used for practice. So in that sense, we would say that knowledge assets in general are potential value, one of the 8 kinds of value. But you could say that our value creation framework is a knowledge asset because it's a tool, or it's a framework, or it's a thing.
It's a language to allow people to talk about value by agreeing on certain elements of value that matter. So, you know, for instance, we have an element of value that we have not talked about, which we call strategic value, which refers to the quality of relationship that a community has established with its stakeholders. And so just by giving this a name, we want to draw attention to communities to pay attention to the quality of their relationship with their stakeholders, whether the stakeholders are upstream stakeholders like managers and funders, or downstream stakeholders like beneficiaries or students or patients. And the reason why we have included that in the language is because through experience, we have found that communities that seem to be good at making a difference tend to have good relationship with their stakeholders, working relationship with their stakeholders. And so I don't know if it's a knowledge asset, but it's a language to allow people to have a rich conversation about value. So this is how we would think about it.
Thank you, Etienne. Thank you, Beverly. Chris, I actually missed one question for Ilaria.
Yes, there's one. The question is from Bruce Summers. It's Ilaria, what has been the value added of standardizing your community managers training process?
Bruce is asking this because I joined their course on community managers, and it has been really useful for us because we adapted the World Bank approach in setting up and managing COPs and a lot of their tools that they shared with us to the needs of IFED. And it was useful because it's really a step-by-step. So if we need to support our communities, which is mature communities, or if we need to set up a new communities, we actually adapted their approach. And that's why it's been really useful for us. So thank you, Bruce, for that opportunity.